All right, well, thanks. That was a wonderful summary of the second part of the story. I want to go back before we even do our reading for this morning and do the first part of this story. So you may remember that in the Old Testament, one of the big pivotal moments in the text has to do with the invasion of these outside armies, these outside nations, empires that come in and they make life miserable for the Hebrew people or for the people of Judah or Israel. And at one point in the Bible, and one point in the Old Testament, there is the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel actually is also noteworthy because it has some of the most fun names to pronounce in the whole Bible. But Nebuchadnezzar and his armies go in and they lay siege not just to the kingdom of Judah, but also to the city of Jerusalem. And we've talked about this before, but one of the practices in those days was it's not just good enough to go in and to sack a city and to take and plunder all of the riches of that city and to leave things in disrepair. But if you're going to really integrate that community into part of your empire, the tactic that they used, which was very effective but also particularly cruel, was that they would take they would pick and choose who they would want. They'd take, say, some of the most gifted people or the people that they thought would be most beneficial to their leadership and their kingdom, and they would take them back into exile to live in this new place. So people like Daniel and 3 of his companions were taken back into Babylonia, while some of the other part of the population was left to rebuild there. And they would also take some of the people from the Babylonian Empire and they would insert them into places like Jerusalem. So it really confused the culture. It made things messy. And basically it was like, we are going to take Babylonian values, we are going to take Babylonian rule, we're going to take Babylonian customs and worship and so forth, and we're going to infuse that into the remnant of the people who are living in somewhere like Jerusalem. And we're going to make that then a part of our empire. So it's not going to be you get to maintain your own culture, your tradition, your values, your religion, and so forth, and you'll just be a part of our empire. Oh no, we're going to go in and disrupt the whole thing. So Daniel is focused, at least the first portion of the book of Daniel, is focused on what happens when Daniel and these 3 companions, known as, and you remember their names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And those names, as confusing as they are, easier to pronounce than their given names. So this is the story about those 4 individuals, and they are taken into Babylonia, now serving under King Nebuchadnezzar. And they were probably seen as some pretty gifted individuals that would have an ability to benefit through their knowledge, through their understanding, the king and the people in Babylonia. So that's where the story starts, really, is that the first couple of sentences say, this is the setting, this is the framework. Now we have where the story picks up. And so Daniel is given this gift from God with the ability to interpret dreams. And at this point, the story has a lot of deja vu kind of moments with the story of Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis, and he goes and he becomes Pharaoh's kind of right-hand man because he can interpret dreams. Well, guess what? History's coming back again full circle, and now we have a different population in exile, except this time it's in Babylon, and Daniel is called upon because he has this gift, this ability to interpret dreams. And Nebuchadnezzar has these terrible nightmares. Daniel interprets the dreams, but this puts him at odds with a group called the Chaldeans, who are the professional dream interpreter people. Can you imagine having so much wealth and power in your kingdom that you just have on staff a group of dream interpreters? Well, that's what Nebuchadnezzar had. So he's got this group, and guess what? They can't interpret the dream correctly, but Daniel can. So that's where we get this group of people that leads to, the fiery furnace and the lion's den and all that stuff. So that's where we pick up with the story today. And Amanda previewed this with the kids, but let me read to you from the 6th chapter, starting in verse 10. This is after the king has been encouraged by this group of professional dream interpreters to come up with a special rule that will get Daniel in big trouble. The rule is that you got to pray to the king for 30 days. Anybody who doesn't, You're going to die, basically, is the gist of it. So, although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and to praise him, just as he had done previously. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. And then what they did is they approached the king and they said, he's been doing this thing. He's been caught red-handed. We saw it. He had his windows open of all things. We saw what he was doing. And now he's got to face the music, or face the lions, as it were. So the king, as you heard Amanda say, now we're on a different king, by the way. We're 3 kings into this story. Now we're on King Darius. Darius says, this hurts my heart. It grieves me deeply to know that this is the punishment, but that's the rule. I signed it. I stamped it. No turning back now. So Daniel is thrown into the den of the lions. He prays that night, and in the morning, the king rushes to the door, rolls away the entrance to the tomb. Does this sound familiar? Looks in, and he finds that Daniel is there. Unharmed, he lives to see a new day. So may God add a blessing to this reading. So that's where we pick up in the story. And I'm going to come back to Daniel in just a minute, but let's jump to what we've been talking about. So for the past few weeks in this season of Lent, we have been in a sermon series that coincides or runs parallel to this book, Soul Feast, that we've been studying in small group. And we've been talking about different spiritual practices or different spiritual disciplines. And we have talked about things like daily reading of the Bible or spiritually guided readings. We talked about the importance of worship. We talked about fasting. We talked about prayer. We talked about confession. We talked about hospitality. And so all of these things provide a framework for taking these ancient religious practices and putting them all together in our lives so that we might find greater connection with God. And I think that these things are terribly important. And the reason why I say that is because it's a pretty regular conversation that I'll have with people that will say, I believe, I consider myself to be a Christian, I worship regularly or as often as I'm able to do with my work schedule, but I also feel like I'm wanting more. I'm hungry for more. It feels like I desire for more to be there. And things like the spiritual disciplines that are laid out in this book, again, which are not Marjorie Thompson's spiritual disciplines, they're spiritual disciplines that the church has been putting to practice for centuries now. But those are the kinds of things that provide just that little more of a push, of a nudge, of a hurdle, that when we cross those, we feel that we find that deeper connection with God. Because it can become easy for us to fall into the habits or the patterns of going to worship, and depending on how distracted we are, how tired we are, what else we've got going on, what's heavy on our hearts, or what we're really excited about, worship, I know, we can find our minds wandering at times, we can be distracted, but we go through worship and sometimes it feels like, and all of us do this, but it feels like we did it because it's part of the practice, but maybe our hearts weren't truly in it that day. And that happens from time to time. But the question is if that's all that is feeding you, is that enough? And for most of us, the answer is no. We have to employ other practices in our lives. And it doesn't necessarily have to be fasting, and it doesn't necessarily have to be focusing on how am I providing hospitality this week. Those things are great, but they don't have to be your things. So there has to be some sort of a framework for how we can begin to continue to flourish. I love how Thompson starts this last chapter, which is called A Rule of Life, which is the idea of putting it all together, putting all of these things together so that we have some sort of spiritual structure or framework for guidance for us. She likens this to like a tomato cage or a string that beans would grow up, right? It needs some kind of support, some sort of basic rough infrastructure for us to continue to grow and flourish. And then she says, once we have that infrastructure in place, then we can begin to not just say my life is just about worship, but it's also about the ways that I serve, the way that I read Bible, how I do intentional prayer life, and things of that nature. And I've had 2 such conversations just in the last week alone with different people who are hungry for more, but want a little bit more of that framework to help facilitate that, to move that along in their life. So, Jay, would you put up that slide, the one with the tomato cage? All right. So she says, if we're going to devise a rule of life, we need to take 3 steps. Take a faith-illuminated inventory of your life as it stands. So don't just look at your calendar, but ask yourself that real and honest question. Be truly open with yourself about, is this the spiritual life that I am truly seeking? Have I found the spiritual balance, the direction that I'm looking for? Then prayerfully discern what will help you grow deeper or toward a deeper communion with God. Is that some of you have said, I need to make sure that I set aside time at least every month for going to help the disadvantaged in our community. And that is something that you have integrated into your rule of life, even if you don't call it that, but you said that's important to you. Others of you have said, I need to journal daily as a way to center myself back to my spiritual life again. Maybe you're the kind of person whose mind wanders in times of prayer. Well, maybe journaling provides some sort of a framework for that, your tomato cage, so to speak. So think of what of those kinds of things that will help you go into deeper communion with God. And Thompson says in the book, again, that those 9 things that we've talked about in small group and in these sermons provide a wonderful beginning point for many of those practices that become a rule of life for us. And then she says, make realistic choices about the disciplines you can actually commit to. Don't say, for example, I'm going to fast 3 days a week when you full well know that isn't going to happen, right? If you're not fasting once a month now, you're not fasting 3 times a week. Let's just be real about this, right? You may get there, but it's not going to happen right out of the gate. So be realistic about this. And these ways of thinking, actually not just for our rule of life and sort of our spiritual facilitation, but as we think about just regular patterns and practices, that's sort of a hot topic right now. How many of you, show of hands, how many of you own a copy of James Clear's book, Atomic Habits? Yeah, like at least a dozen of you in this room. So I picked up that book. It was recommended. I think I read it as part of a small group several years ago. And I pulled out my copy again this week, and it has a little sticker on it. It says, over 1 million copies sold. You know how many sold today? More than 14 million. 14 million copies of a book that is about making good habits. So clearly, I think we are hungry for this as a culture. We have all kinds of things that are pulling us in different directions and demanding our time, but we want to focus them. We want to have clear habits. And the things that she's talking about in terms of spiritual disciplines are very similar to some of the things that are in that book, Atomic Habits, which is a secular book. But things like, set a goal that you can actually meet, that you can look forward to, something that feels like, yes, I did it when you were able to do it. Right? And so these things are complementary. So again, it's a spiritual hunger, or a sort of a secular hunger that I feel that there is a spiritual response for, at least for people like us that are believers, and where we seek to find that. And these spiritual disciplines can provide that kind of beginning place for all of us. Now, when we look at the Bible, we don't always find these sort of rules of life examples. Yes, there's talk about worship, plenty of talk about worship, and there's talk about prayer, and there's talk about fasting, and we see all of these things, but we don't oftentimes see it laid out like this or that person had a rule of life, because this idea only came about really after the advent of the church. But we do see some places that this continues to show itself. And one of those places is in this book of Daniel, where Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they pray 3 times a day. 3 times a day. And it's not just I'm whispering a prayer as I'm walking down the hall. That's not I pray something in the shower. That's not oh God, please help me get through this moment. Amen. There's nothing wrong with those prayers, but this is the kind of prayer that sounds way more like a rule of life, spiritual discipline kind of way of praying. 3 times a day, on their knees, praying with the windows open. It's a kind of prayer life that offers structure and guidance. I have no doubt that that kind of rule that he was following, or that kind of practice that Daniel was allowing to lead his life, was something that helped him get through some of these most difficult moments. You see, Daniel and his companions knew that after they had been removed from Judah, that it was going to be more and more, just increasingly difficult to try to maintain their beliefs, to try to maintain their connection to God and to their people and their customs. They had, after all, been physically removed and taken away somewhere else, put under somebody else's leadership in somebody else's culture with somebody else's religion. And if they were going to maintain that, they had to stay true to these spiritual disciplines and practices. And so they had dietary rules that they followed. It talks about that in Daniel, and it talks about the way that they engaged in prayer 3 times a day. And I have no doubt in my mind that that was absolutely essential for them. It grounded them. It helped them through this. What we tend to do is we go through life and then we get to a crisis moment and then we wish that we had some of these practices to lean on. But we're trying to do it and playing catch up at the same time. But seasons of Lent every single year are set aside times where we can actually remember that these practices and others like them and the ways that we sort of change our mindset for a season, it helps us to prepare for all that is to come, for the remainder of the year. We talked about, will Good Friday be more meaningful if we have engaged in some of these spiritual practices in these 40 days leading up to it? Will Easter Sunday be more meaningful because we have participated fully in Lent? If we take on some of these practices, will we be better able to celebrate the highs and to weather the storms that remain ahead of us because these practices are in place? And will we, when we come together to worship, find this more meaningful? Because in many ways we have been preparing for this day for the past 6. Not only that, but Daniel's story also reminds us that when we practice these kind of spiritual disciplines or acts, they are a way of providing witness for what we believe and what matters most for us. King Nebuchadnezzar and then later on King Darius find that when they observe Daniel in these sort of what to them appear to be peculiar practices, and they inquire about them, it gives Daniel and his companions an opportunity to talk about the God that they worship, to explain their values, to share what God has done for their people and in their life. And in that sense, it doesn't feel like a forced, heavy-handed evangelism, but it feels like, I've noticed that you're not eating today. Are you okay? Well, actually, I'm fasting. Well, tell me about that. I've noticed, Daniel, that you pray in your room in private. And a few people have observed you by, peeping through your windows. Tell me about this practice. Well, in our tradition, this is what we do, and here's why we do it. Well, tell me about who you worship. Tell me about that God. And then when Daniel walks out of the lion's den, Darius is so grateful that he has survived this thing that he inquires again about God and says, I want to know more about your God. How can I begin to pay my respect to your God, to worship your God? These spiritual practices as we've talked about them throughout these several weeks, on the surface feel obvious or out of reach or antiquated. But as you've probably discovered, as I have, when we dive deeper into them, we realize that there is so much substance there. There's so much meaning and backstory behind each of these things. And when we actually are truly intentional about trying to practice these things, we'll find that they offer the same kind of blessing and depth that they have to those who have gone before us. There's a reason they've stuck around all of these years, and that's because they are timeless. They do speak to our lives. They allow us to be in greater communion with God. They enrich our lives, and they may even have the opportunity for us to share our faith with others. As we draw this season of Lent to a close in the next 2 weeks, I pray that if you haven't already, that you begin to think about what some of these practices might look like in your life. If you were to develop a, quote, rule of life, what would you include in that? How would those practices of devotional readings, picking up a read through the Bible program, grab a book at the bookstore that looks interesting, that will help you go deeper in your faith? Have you thought about opportunities to serve? Have you thought about withholding something from yourself so that you can be in greater connection with God? Have you considered what it means to dive deeper into this story? Have you thought about what it would be like to prepare for worship on Sunday morning before you roll in? Have you thought about how you pray, and different ways of switching up your prayer life might lead to greater appreciation for that time of prayer? Have you thought about removing yourself to be in isolation for just enough time to allow your head to clear and to think about your priorities and how you are ordering your life? Have you thought about extending a hand of hospitality, especially to those in a time of desperation or great need? These are subtle things that we can do, but when they become a part of our regular rhythms, when they become our atomic habits, when they become our rules of life, they lead to changes that we could never have anticipated. And when we do that collectively, when we think about a whole congregation of people participating in those things together, that's when the real special stuff happens. That's when we see God work in an even more powerful way. And that's what we desire for Grace, for our community, and for the world around us. But it begins with the conscious choice of saying, I know what I believe. I know what I aspire to be, but I need to take the effort and offer that first step in making it happen. May it be so, especially as we continue in this Lenten experience together. Will you pray with me?